What lives after love dies? A man once full of charm and wit writes from a forgotten island, Delos, sacred to Apollo, now silent and desolate. He is bound by invisible chains, haunted by the soul of a wife who once tried to revive a long-dead mystery cult, drawing down ancient gods and transfiguring herself through ritual art and something far older than reason. In a mansion of endless chambers lit by perfumed oil, something stirs, something born of beauty, death, and myth. As memory decays and sanity loosens its grip, only a scarlet thread guides the living through a maze of vision, shadow, and flesh. My name is Tony Walker, and I am the narrator of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, a very human narrator. Listen now, it's good.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Huguenin's Wife by Matthew Phipps Shiel, published in 1895. Ah, bitter sweet. Keats. Huguenin, my friend, the man of art and thrills and impulses, the boulevardier, the persifleur, must, I conclude, be frenzied, when after years of silence I received from him this letter. Stili, my friend, that is the name by which they now call this ancient Delos. Wherefore has it been written, so passeth the glory of the world. Ah, but to me it is, as to her it was, still Delos, the sacred island, birthplace of Apollo, son of Leto. On the summit of Cynthus I look from my dwelling, and within the wide reach of the Cyclades perceive even yet the offerings of fruit from Syria, from Sicily, from Egypt. I see the boats that bear the sacred envoys of Pan-Ionium to festival. I note the flutter of their robes. On the breeze once more float to me their songs of deliverance. The island now belongs almost entirely to me. I am, too, almost its sole inhabitant. It is, only 4 miles long and half as broad, and I have bought up every available foot of its face. On the flat top of granite Cynthus I live, and here, my friend, I shall die. Fetters more inexorable and horrible than the limbs of Prometheus ever felt rivet me to this crag. A friend, that is the hunger of my sick spirit, a living man. Of the dead, I've had enough. Of living monsters, too much. A servant or two who seem persistently to shun me. This is all I possess of human fellowship. Yet I dare not implore you, my old companion, to come to the comfort of a sinking man in this place of desolation. The epistle continued in a strain of mingled rhapsody and despair, containing, moreover, a long rigmarole on the Pythagorean dogma of the metempsychosis of the soul. 3 times did the words living monsters occur. From London to Delos is a journey, yet conquered during a long vacation by an irresistible impulse and the fond memories of other days, I actually found myself, on a starry night, disembarking on the sands that bound the once renowned harbour of the island, the date of my arrival being just 2 months before the extraordinary phenomena of which Delos was the scene during the night of August 13th, 1899. I first crossed the ring of flat land that encircles the islet, and then commenced the ascent of the central rise. The air slumberous with the breath of rose, jasmine, almond, with the cicala crying, the firefly. In 40 minutes I had walked into a tangled garden and placed my hand on the back of a tall man in Attic garments who was pacing there. With a start he faced me. "Oh!" panting, clapping his hands upon his chest. I was startled. My heart. It was Huguenin, yet not he. The beard rolling over his snowy robes of wool was still ebon as ever. but the fluff of hair that floated with every zephyr over his face and neck was a fluff of wool white. He stared at me with the lifeless and cavernous eyes of a dead man. When we entered the dwelling, its mere appearance was enough to convince me that in some mysterious way, to some morbid degree, the past had fettered and darkened the intellect of my friend. The mansion was of Hellenic type, but nothing less than mad in extent, a desert more than a habitation. A Greek house multiplied many times over into a series of Greek houses, like objects seen through angular glasses. It consisted of a single story, though here and there on the flat roof there rose a second layer of apartments attained by ladders. We walked by a door, opening inwards, into a passage, which took us to a courtyard or aule surrounded by Corinthian pillars, and having in the middle an altar of marble to Zeus Ercheos. Around this court were ranged chambers, thalamoi, hung with velvets, and the whole house, made up of 100 reproductions of such courtyards with their surrounding chambers, formed a trackless Sahara of halls, through whose labyrinths the most crafty could not but fail to thread his way. This building, Huguenin said to me some days after my arrival, this building, every stone, plank, drapery, was the creation of my wife's wild fancy. I stared at him. You doubt that I have, or had, a wife? Come with me. You shall see her face. He now led the way through the windowless house, lighted throughout by day and night by the reddish rays shed from many little censer lamps of terracotta with nardinum, an oil pressed from the blossom of the fragrant grass nardus of the Arabs. I followed Huguenin through a good number of the rooms, noticing that, as he moved slowly onward, he kept his body bent, seeming to seek for something, and this sometimes I found to be a red thread laid down on the floor to afford a clue for the foot through the mazes of the house. Suddenly he stopped before the door of one of the apartments called Amphithalamoi, and, himself staying without, motioned me to enter. Now, I am hardly a man of what might be called a tremulous diathesis, yet it was not without a tremor that I looked round the room. At first I could discern little under the glimmer from a single lampas hanging in the middle, but presently a painting in oils, unframed, occupying nearly one side of the room, grew upon my sight, the painting of a woman, and my pulses underwent a strange agitation as I gazed on her face. She stood robed in a flowing peplos ruby, her head thrown back, one hand and arm pointing starkly upward. The countenance was not merely Grecian, antique Grecian, as distinct from modern, but Grecian in a highly exaggerated and unlifelike degree. Was the woman, I asked myself, more lovely than ever mortal was before, or more loathsome? For Lamia stood there before me, shape of gorgeous hue, vermilion spotted, golden, green, and blue, and a kind of surprise held me fixed as the image slowly took possession of my vision. The Gorgon's head, whose hair was snakes, and, as I thought of this, I thought too of how from the guttering gore of the Gorgon's head monsters arose. And then, with abhorrence, I remembered Huguenin's ravings as to monsters. I stepped nearer in order to analyze the impression almost of dread wrought upon me, and I quickly found, or thought that I had found, the key. It lay in the lady's eyes, the very eyes of the tigress, greedy glories of green glaring with radii of gold. I hurried from her. Have you seen her? Huguenin asked me with an eager leer of cunning. Yes, Huguenin, I said. She is very beautiful. She painted it herself, he said in a whisper. Really? She considered herself, she was, the greatest painter since Apelles. But now, where is she? He brought his lips to my ear. Dead. You, at any rate, would say so. Well, to words so apparently senseless I would pay no attention then, but there recurred to me when I unearthed the circumstance that it was his way at certain intervals to make furtive visits to distant districts of the dwelling. Our bedchambers being close together, I could not fail, as time passed, to notice that he would rise in the dead of night, when he supposed me drowsing, and gathering together the fragments of our last repast, would depart rapidly and soundlessly with them to the vastness of the house, led always in one particular direction by the thread of silk whose crimson lay over the floor. I now set myself strenuously to the study of Huguenin. The name and nature of his physical sickness, at least, was clear. The affliction to which physicians have given the name Cheney-Stokes respiration, compelling him to lie back at times in an agony of inhalation and groan for air. The bones of his cheeks seemed to be near appearing through their sere trumpery of mummy skin. The alae of his nose got no repose from their extravagance of expansion and retraction. But even this wreck of a body might, I believed, be rescued, had it not been that to assuage the rage and feverishness of such a mind, the spheres contained no time. For one thing, a belief in some unnamed fate hanging over the little land he lived on haunted him. Again and again he recalled to me all that in the far past had been written in regard to Delos. The notion contained both in Homeric and the Alexandrian hymns to the Delian Apollo that Delos was floating, or that it was only held by chains, or that it had been thrown up from the ocean as a temporary resting place for Ortygia in her travail, or that it might sink again before the spurning foot of the newborn god. He was never weary through hours of pursuing, as if in soliloquy, a species of sleepy exegesis of such scriptures as we read together. "Do you know," he said to me, "that the Greeks really believed the streams of Delos to rise and fall with the rise and fall of the Nile? Could anything point more strongly to the extraordinary character of this land, its far-extending volcanic constructions, occult geologic eccentricities? Then he might recite the punning line of the very old Sibylline prophecy, 'And Samos shall be sand, and Delos, the far seen, sink from sight.' Often also, having recited it, he would strike from the repining chords of a lyre the theme of a threnody, which, as he told me, his wife had composed to suit the line. And when to the funereal mode of this tune, so wild with woe and whining that I could never listen to it without a thrill, Huguenin added the sadness of his now so hollow voice. The intensity of its effect upon me got to the intolerable degree, and I was glad of that pallid gloaming of the mansion which partially hid my emotion. "Remark, however," he said one day, "the meaning of the far seen as regards Delos. It means glorious, illustrious, far seen to the spiritual rather than to the physical eye, for the island is not very elevated. The words 'sink from sight' must therefore be supposed to have the corresponding significance of an extinction of this glory. And now think whether or not this prophecy has not been already fulfilled, when I tell you that this sacrosanct land, which no dog's foot was once permitted to touch, on which no man was permitted to be born or buried, bears at this moment on its bosom a monster more loathsome than even a demon's brain, I believe, ever conceived. A literal, physical fulfillment of the prophecy cannot, I consider, be always wanting. But all this esotericism was not native to Huguenin. His mind, I was convinced, had been ploughed into by some very potent energy before this growth had choked it. I enticed him, little by little, to speak of his wife. She was, he told me, of a very antique Athenian family, which by constant effort had preserved its purity of blood, and it was while moving through Greece in a world-weary mood that on reaching one night to the village of Castri, there, on the site of the ancient Delphi, in the centre of an angry throng of Greeks and Turks who threatened to rend her to fragments, he first saw Andromeda, his wife. This incredible courage, he said, this This vast originality was hers, to take upon herself the part of a modern Hypatia, to venture upon the task of bringing back of the gods in the midst of fanatics at the end of a century like the present. The crowd from which I rescued her was howling round her in the vestibule of a temple to Apollo, whose cult she was then and there attempting to set up. The love of the woman fastened upon her preserver with passionate fervour, and Huguenin, constrained by the vigour of a will not to be resisted, came at her bidding to live in the grey building of her creation at Delos, in which solitude, under which shadow, the man and the woman faced each other. Ere many weeks it was revealed to the husband that he had married a seer of visions and a dreamer of dreams. And visions of what tinge, and dreams of what madness! He confessed to me that he was awed by her, and with this awe was blended a feeling which, if it was not fear, was akin to fear. That he loved her not at all he now knew, while the extravagance of her passion for him he grew to regard as gruesome. Yet his mind took on the hue of hers. He drank in her doctrines, followed her as a satellite. When for days she hid herself from him, he would wander desolate and full of search over his pathless home. Finding that she habitually yielded her body to the delights of certain seeds that grew on Delos, he found the courage to frown, but ended by himself becoming a bond-slave to the drowsy ganja of Hindustan. So too with the most strange fascination which she exercised over the animal world. He disliked it, dreaded it, regarded it as excessive and unnatural, but looked on only with the furtive eye of suspicion and said nothing. When she walked, she was accompanied by a magnetized queue of living things, felines in particular, and birds of large size, while dogs, on the contrary, shunned her, bristling. She had brought with her from the continent a throng of these followers, of which Huguenin had never beheld the half, since they were imprisoned in unknown nooks of the building, and anon she would vanish to reappear with new companions. Her kindness to these creatures should no doubt have been sufficient to account for her power over them, but Huguenin's mind, already grown morbid, probed darkly after other explanation. The motif of this unquietness doubtless lying in his wife's fanaticism on the matter of the Pythagorean dogma of the transmigration of souls. On this theme, Andromeda, it was clear, was outrageously deranged. She would stand, he declared, with her arm outstretched, her eyes wild staring, her body rigid and in a rapid recitative, like the rapt Pythoness, prophecy of the mutations prepared for the spirit of man, dwelling, above all, with contempt on the paucity of animal forms in the world, and insisting that the spirit of an original man, disembodied, should and must re-embody itself in a correspondingly original form. And, she would often add, such forms exist, but the God, willing to save the race from frenzy, hides them from the eyes of common men. It was long, however, before I could get Huguenin to describe the final catastrophe of his wedded life. He related it in these words. You now know that Andromeda was among the great painters. You have gazed at her portrait of herself. Well, one day, after dilating, as was her wont, on the paucity of form, she said, "But you too shall be of the initiated. Come, you shall see something." She then went swiftly, beckoning, looking back often to smile on me a fond patronage, and I followed, till she stopped before a painting, pointing. I will not attempt, the attempt would be folly, to tell you what thing I saw before me on the canvas. Nor can I explain in words the tempest of anger, of loathing, of disgust that stirred within me at the sight. But at that blasphemy of her fancy, I raised my hand to strike her head, and to this moment I know not if I struck. The blow, if blow there was hardly hard enough to harm a creature far feebler than man. Yet she fell. The film of death spread over her upbraiding eye. One last thing only she spoke, pointing to the uncleanness. You may yet see it in the flesh. And so, still pointing, sped away. I bore her body embalmed in the Greek manner by an artist of Corinth to one of the smaller apartments on the roof, and saw, as I moved to leave her in the gloom, the mortal smile on her lip within the open coffin. 2 weeks later, I went again to visit her. My friend, she had vanished. But for the bones, and from the coffin, above that skull, 2 eyes living, the very eyes of Andromeda, but full of a newborn brightness. The eyes, too, of the horror she had painted, whose form I now made out in the darkness, looked out upon me. After I had slammed the door, I fainted on the stair. The suggestion, I said to him, which you seem to wish to convey, is that of a transition of forms from man to animal. But surely the explanation that the monster, brought by your wife into the house, or born in it, imprisoned unawares by you with the dead, and maddened by famine, fed on the body, is, if not less horrible, yet less improbable. He looked doubtingly at me a moment, and then coldly said, there was no monster imprisoned with the dead. But at least, I pleaded, he would see the necessity of flying from the place. He replied with the avowal that it was no longer doubtful to him, from the effect which any neglect to minister to the monster's wants had upon his own health, that his life was bound up with the life of the being he stayed to maintain. That with the second murder which he should perpetrate, nay, with the attempt to perpetrate it, as by flight from the island, his life would be forfeited. I accordingly formed the idea to effect the deliverance of my friend in spite of himself. 2 months had now passed. The end of my visit was drawing near, yet his maladies of brain and body were not relieved, and it pained me to think of leaving him once more alone, a prey to his manias. That very day, while he slept his damp trances, I started my tramp on the track of the scarlet thread. So far it went, and the halls through which it passed were of such uniformity, and its path was so wound about, that I could not doubt that, the clue once snapped at any point, the voyage to its end could be accomplished only by the most improbable chance. I followed the thread to where it stopped at the foot of a ladder stair. This I ascended to a door at its top, a door with a hole close to the floor, big enough to admit a plate. But as I placed my foot on the uppermost step, a whine, complaining low, with a wild likeness to a woman's wail, sent me skipping sick whence I came. But some little distance from the steps I broke the thread, and gathering it up in my hand as I ran, again broke it near the region of the mansion which we occupied. In this way, I said, as I held the mass of thread to the flame of a lamp, shall a man be saved? I watched him afterwards through my half-shut eyes as he departed, haggard and shuddering, hugging himself on his nightly errand, and my heart galloped in an agony of disquiet while I awaited his coming again. He was long, but when he came swiftly, softly into my chamber and shook me by the shoulder. On his face was a look of unusual coolness, of dignity, of mystery. "Wake up," he said. "I wish you to leave me tonight. But tell me, I will take no refusal. Trust me this once and go. There is a danger here. 2 of the fisher folk of the harbour will convey you to Renia before the morning." "But danger?" I said. "From what?" "I cannot tell you. From the destiny, whatever it be, which awaits me. The thread on which my life depends is snapped. But suppose I tell you that—" "Ah! You hear that?" He held up his hand and hearkened. It was a sound of howling round the house. "It's the wind rising," I muttered, starting up. "But that which followed, didn't you feel it?" I made him no answer. He now clasped with his arms a marble column upon which he rested his forehead, while with one foot he kept on patting the floor, in which posture, quite demoralized and craven, he remained for some time, while the wind continued to rise. And suddenly he span towards me with a scream and a rapture of fear. "Now at least you feel it!" I could not deny. It was as if the island itself had rocked a little to and fro on a pivot. Now, thoroughly demoralized myself, I now caught Huguenin's arm and sought to draw him from the column, which, muttering low, he was again hugging. But he wouldn't stir, and I determined in any event to stay by him, stood hearing the earthquakes increase, while he seemed to take no further note of anything, remaining there, motionless but for the motion of his foot. In this way some minutes went by, at the end of which the rocking had become strong, rapid, and continuous. There came a second, when, captured by a new panic, I sprang to shake him, understanding that some lamp had been dashed down in that passion of the mansion's agitation. "Why, man," I cried, "have you parted with every sense? Can't you feel that the house is in flames?" On this his eyes, which had become dazed and dull, blazed up with a new lunacy. Then he suddenly shouted in a passion of loudness, "I say she shall be saved!" Before I could lay hold of him, he had dashed past me into a passage. I followed in hot pursuit through rooms and corridors that seemed to reel in a dream of heat and reek, hoping that he, weak of lung, would fall choked and exhausted. But some energy seemed to lend him strength, and he rushed like the hurricane. Some mysterious sense led him. Never once did he hesitate. And after all the long chase, which ever swayed at the rocking of the land but never stopped, I saw that the intuitions of insanity had not failed the madman. He got to the goal he gasped after. I saw him fly up the ladder, whose foot was in a pool of fire, saw him fly to the door of the tomb of Andromeda, already flagrant, and drag it open. But as he dragged it, there broke out of the room, above the roaring of the conflagration and of the gale, and of that thousandfold growling of the ground, a shriek, shrill yet ugly with gutturalness, which congealed in me that heat, and I saw proceeding from the interior a creature whose obscenity and vileness language has no vocabulary to describe. For if I say that it was a cat of great size, its eyes glaring like a conflagration, its fat frame wrapped in a mass of feathers, grey, vermilion-tipped, with a similitude of miniature wings on it, with a width of tail vast, downturned, like the tails of birds of paradise. How, by such words, can I express half of all the retching of my nausea, the shame, the hate? The fire had ere this reached the thing, and on fire I could see it fly rather than spring at Huguenin's heart, saw its fangs buried in his breast through a haze of feathers raining, he tottering, tearing at the feathery horror, as backward he toppled from the landing over the spot where a moment before the ladder had stood. By blessed luck, as I ran thence, I stumbled upon some exit to find the night outside quite cloudless, starlit, though all the winds were whistling within the vault of sky that night. In descending to the level, I remarked a rather scorched aspect of some of the leafage, and at one spot saw a series of conical openings in the ground with greenish scoriae round their edges. Lower still, I stood on a bluff, and looking over the sea, witnessed a sight sublime to wildness, for the sea too hurried to show billow or ripple, and lit up within its depth with a sheen of phosphorescence, was speeding towards Delos. Delos indeed seemed to float, to be swimming like a little doomed fowl counter to the swoop of the boundless. With the morning's light, I passed away from this mysterious shrine of Grecian piety, the final sight that greeted my gaze being the still rising reek of Huguenin's grave.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you? You tried.
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret of the dead come back?
So that was Huguenin's Wife by Matthew Phipps Shiel, born 1865, died 1947, well out of copyright. He was a British author, best known for his contributions to supernatural horror and early science fiction. Born on the 21st of July 1865 on the Caribbean island of Montserrat, this, as we would say in Workington, the son of Priscilla Ann Blake and Matthew Dowdy Shiel, he grew up in a culturally diverse colonial environment. Educated at Harrison College in Barbados, Shiel moved to England in 1885 and adopted the pen name Shiel, under which he built a reputation for tales of the uncanny, decadent, this is this one, and speculative. I think we've got them all, but decadent it is, isn't it? And I think that's an important thing to remember. His literary career began with short stories published in leading periodicals such as The Strand magazine, big name there, and he quickly gained attention through a story he wrote called Prince Zaleski, 1895, Shapes in the Fire, 1896, both issued in John Lane's Keynote series. These works, heavily influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, placed Shiel within the English decadent movement. He achieved popular success with The Yellow Danger, 1898, a sensational serial capitalizing on the fin de siècle fears of Asian threat, though he later dismissed it as hack work. Shiel's most enduring literary legacy lies in The Purple Cloud, published 1901, a post-apocalyptic novel and the culminating volume in a loosely connected trilogy of future histories. Widely regarded as a neglected masterpiece of early British science fiction, the novel confronts themes of annihilation, isolation, and metaphysical transformation, drawing upon contemporary scientific discourse in geology and biology, and it influenced later writers, including Stephen King. Shiel's output was varied and often shaped by economic necessity. He produced a series of popular mystery and adventure novels, many in collaboration with Louis Tracy, some under pseudonyms such as Gordon Holmes and Robert Fraser. At the same time, he pursued a more personal and experimental fiction, notably The Weird Oit, 1902, which he regarded as a modern spiritual allegory. 1898, he married Carolina Garcia Gomez, but the marriage ended in separation a few years later. In 1919, he married again to Esther Lydia Jewson, also ended in estrangement, clouded by troubling allegations. Here we go, get ready. Shiel was convicted of indecent assault on his 12-year-old de facto stepdaughter and sentenced to 16 months hard labour. This conviction, long obscured, has prompted recent critical reassessment of his work, particularly its frequent idealisation and sexualisation of young female characters. We don't have that in this story. In later life, Shiel pursued political and religious writing, including a lengthy translation and commentary on the Gospel of Luke, and cultivated the myth of the Kingdom Redonda, a literary hoax in which he claimed royal title to a small uninhabited island in the West Indies. His literary executor, John Goldsworth, perpetuated this myth after Shiel's death and helped preserve his legacy. He died in Chichester on 17th February 1947. He published over 30 books, including 25 novels, and is remembered chiefly for The Purple Cloud, still regarded as a seminal work of early speculative fiction. Let's talk about this story, Huguenin's Wife. So it was published in the Pall Mall magazine, April 1895. It forms part of his early decadent and symbolist influenced fiction, and later appeared in his short story collection Shapes in the Fire, 1896, published by John Lane as part of his Keynote series. The Keynote series also featured writers such as John Davidson and George Edgerton. So this situates in this context, puts Shiel in the decadent movement. And you've got this late Victorian period flourishing of the decadent and symbolist literature, and you've got Oscar Wilde, clearly. You can see that in some of the prose, and Arthur Machen and Vernon Lee. We've done all of those on the Classic Ghost Stories podcast. Like his earlier Prince Zaleski, 1896, not much earlier, just a month or so. Actually, I'd be interested in separating the chronology of that. His ornate prose style, his engagement with myth and metaphysics, if you look at symbolist stuff, there's a lot of Greek stuff in the symbolists. His ornate prose style, his preoccupation with beauty and horror in their most unstable forms. And of course, we've talked before about the Gothic and how it claimed to be a route to the sublime through the horrific. So, the sublime can be approached in two directions. One is through transcendence, such as the, earlier than this, but the romantic urge, the beautiful, the wonderful, the uplifting, but also, and the Gothic, and the more thoughtful Gothics, because you've got to remember that a lot of Gothic is just schlock horror, really. It's just intended to, it's like the clickbaity stuff of the internet, just giving people what they want, which isn't what you want, isn't always what you need. But the more the Gothics who were claiming, and certainly the symbolists and the decadent movement claimed to approach the spiritual, or at least spiritual in the sense of numinous, through the horrific. And this is where he is really. Right, let's talk about the thematic stories. I don't mean stories, I mean themes in the story. One of which is obsession, because this Huguenin appears both physically and mentally enervated, doesn't he? He's ill. He's got this... Actually, Cheney-Stokes breathing was something we were told happens at the end of life. Not that he can live with it, but I take his word for it. So it's somebody with, severe physical problems, and he looks unwell. He's mentally and physically unwell, and we ascribe this to him because he says that he was obsessed by the strength of character of this Andromeda. I met girls like that, and I was obsessed by their strength of character as well, obviously, Actually, it reminds me of, I'm going to jump aside now. I think a year or two ago, I watched a film called The Witch of King's Cross. King's Cross, actually, in Australia, in Melbourne. Sorry, I'm not up. Oh, Sydney. I do apologise. Sydney. Okay, so there's a woman called Rosalie Norton, an artist and self-identified witch. And this is she was into the occult, but also in an artistic way. And she was this very powerful, strong character. And this Andromeda reminded me of her. She's clearly a visionary. Also, I don't mean to tar her with this brush. I'm not saying she's as nutty as this, but PJ Harvey, I always thought PJ Harvey, some of her work is kind of like this CRS, really, with this really amazingly strong presence. So you get the kind of lady woman she was, and he is completely, Huguenin himself is described as this kind of, which is a boulevardier, he's a man about town having a great time. And he sees this Andromeda, you're trying to set up the cult of Apollo, and there's these Turks and Muslims, obviously Turks and Greeks, presumably Muslims and Orthodox Christians, in a time when there were lots of Turks, presumably pre the 1920s war, when the populations were split between Greece and Turkey, but there was a lot of Turks living in Greece and a lot of Greeks living in Turkey. And so you can imagine neither side of devout believers were very keen on her resurrecting, literally, old Apollonian cults. Yeah, so he's spellbound by her. That's the point. So it's about his obsession, and he even says, I mean, we get to the story, he doesn't love her. It's just like an obsession, and he can't do any. He's bound to her, and she is this immensely powerful character, and so it's about obsession and the loss of autonomy. It's not built on love or partnership, but on compulsion and surrender. And then the Susanna Clarke, again, I often talk about Susanna Clarke, her book Piranesi, this is labyrinthine structure that you enter into an ordinary house, and this temple structure that she's built on Delos, which is, it's hard to believe that in reality anything could be built so large that you couldn't find your way, and it's clearly an allusion to the labyrinth, isn't it? And the thread, also Ariadne's thread potentially as well. So he's putting a lot of classical allusions to classical myth in this, and you can only find you, and also the breadcrumbs, I suppose, in Hansel and Gretel. Is it Hansel and Gretel? Yeah, where you get lost, the birds eat your breadcrumbs. So it's hard to believe that that's a literal thing, that the house could be so, and it's described as kind of just almost like mirror images, like you regression, you put an image and reflects itself and it reflects itself and it reflects itself, and it goes on forever. This is what it feels like. So it felt like the house in Piranesi. It's clearly like the ancient Greek labyrinth on Crete, and you can't find your way now. So presumably you just wander around. The only place the thread leads is to the grave of Andromeda, so how do you find your way around? Say if you went wandering and you got lost in the rest of it, you'd be stuck, wouldn't you? Because there's no thread. The thread only goes one way. I suppose if you stumbled across the thread, follow it one way or the other, you're either going to end up at Andromeda's little resty place, or you're going to end up back in the more habitable areas. So it's clearly metaphorical, and I think probably we've all had these dreams of labyrinthine structures, which kind of represents the soul, I suppose. In fashionably, we would analyse those kind of images as being representations of the human soul. So he's kind of lost, and in this labyrinth is a monster, and that's very Freudian as well. And this is the creature. I mean, if we Freud's idea, he had lots of ideas, but one was that we are socialized, and the id, which is the primal urges, Freud was very keen, and he said to Jung, we must avoid the black mud of the occult. So he was a rationalist, a scientist, and he was very clear in the rationalist 19th century that he wanted to avoid any kind of mystical nonsense. Although if you go to his museum in Vienna, it's full of God images, Freud's is. But I mean, he would have repudiated that. And it was part of that kind of materialist reduction. I mean, he wasn't, but the materialist reduction of everything to, it's just a machine. None of it means anything. It's just mechanics. It's the mechanics of the mind we're interested in. None of it points to anything. None of it has any significance other than these very mundane sex and murder type things. I think Freud was a lot more complicated than he thought he was, to be honest, but than he said he was. Anyway, if there are any Freudians listening, I'm sure they can spit out their coffee at that, as people do. So, what is she? She is not, I mean, she's not human, is she? She's an archetype. This is Jung. I'm moving over to Jung now. Andromeda is not a human woman in many senses. And even when I was talking about these other women who are real, these artist women, perhaps men, perhaps women also, project archetypes onto them. So they are human people who go to the toilet, they eat beans, they trip up, but when they're mythic, we are projecting mythic structures from our psyche onto them. They're archetypes. So, but this Andromeda is never anything else. It's hard to see her as she isn't really a human woman. And at the end, she's transformed into this chimera, which, in Jungian terms, right? So the female, the personified female archetype is the anima, the soul. And the soul is seen as a bridge to the first encounter is with the shadow, but the second is with the anima, and she is the archetype which leads us into the reality of the psyche. So she, and we've got to understand that in Jungian terms, these figments, these archetypes, are people. It's not that they are figments of our imaginations. They are personalities, autonomous personalities existing in our psyches. And we go through her. She is the bridge. She's the mother in some senses, the bride. And we meet the rest of the unconscious, which is, in the deeper we go, the less human it is. And so we see this inhuman chimera, this figure that's part cheetah. There are two versions of this story, actually. I read one of them. In the other version, it's actually mentioned as a cheetah. So it's part bird. It's almost like the beasts in Ezekiel, isn't it? They are chimeras. They are things put together that could not be, and they represent. The deeper we go into the psyche, is what I'm saying, is the less human, the less sensible, in the sense that we can make sense of it, these creatures are. And I think at the end, it is a power. It's hard to understand what the chimera is. So anyway, but this man is possessed by his anima, in a sense. It's vampiric on him, One thing Jung said many times was that the unconscious contains the opposites. It is everything and nothing. It is paradoxical. It can't be understood. It is life-giving, fructifying, but it is also poisonous. And if we approach it with an ego which is not sufficiently strong, and Jung's idea was that our first part of our lives was to build up an ego, a sense of who we are as individuals, as human beings living in a human place, in a human world, going and paying our bills and going to work and things like that, and having relationships with people. And that gives us a shell, and it enables us really to perhaps confront these inhuman things later on without being destroyed by them. But if our ego is not strong enough, we will be destroyed by the unconscious. It will suck us in, it will obliterate us, we will come apart, we will succumb to it, so anyway, that's that. That's the point. The unconscious is magnetic. It draws us to it. It has an endless fascination. When you find yourself being overwhelmingly obsessive about something, whether that be a person, whether you fall in love, or whether it's power, or whether it's whatever it is, the unconscious is activated. It is that mesmeric power of the unconscious, and this is what she does. And I think I'm probably not expert enough at all to talk about symbolism. I went to a couple of exhibitions about it, but it's worth looking into, because the idea of a symbol is the unconscious presents us symbols. We cannot understand the unconscious. The best we can get is to have the symbol presented to us. And I suppose Freud has been looked down upon by Jungians by saying that he presents the symbols of dreams and things like that as mere crossword puzzles to be understood. And that's what that means, a cipher, if you like. We can understand it. But as a Jungian understanding would be to say that we cannot understand these. All we can do is acknowledge the symbolism. These symbols that present themselves to us in the forms of our obsessions, our dreams, the things that fascinate us. We can only look at them, hold them, we can talk to them, we can ask what they want, because remember, they are personalities, but they're not simply to be decoded in the sense of a person isn't to be decoded. A person just doesn't have one simple meaning. All we can do is to spend time with these things, if we can bear it without being destroyed, and absorb what they want from us. Because I suppose there's a process ongoing that the unconscious always is prompting us, is pushing us forward. It wants us. It's dynamic. It usually goes in spirals rather than circles or straight lines, but there we are. And I think the symbolists were aware of that. They presented symbols without... I often talk about David Lynch, and he famously wouldn't comment on his work. They said, what does it mean? He wouldn't say. And I think that was because he didn't particularly know, or didn't care to know. And of course, he said when he was a painter, people didn't say to him, what does that yellow mean? And so he resisted, in the same way, a film that he would make didn't mean anything in that sense, not in the sense of a crossword puzzle. Oh, I understand that now. But to spend time with this living archetypal personality is to know yourself, to be brought alive by it, in a sense. She is the monstrous feminine. So the anima figure, whatever this means, and I've just said we can't really understand it, is both life-giving and a bridge to the greater unconscious, but is devouring as well. We've got to be monstrous. And I talk about there are male figures that occur in the psyche as well, but we don't see them particularly in this story. So what is the meaning? Okay, we get it. It's the omphalos. So the omphalos is the center of the world, and Delos is an omphalos. It's a Greek sense of the sacred center of the world. And there's the labyrinthine temple, palace, which represents the self. This guy, Huguenin, this is a story of a man who's confronted or has been drawn into the unconscious, but hasn't been strong enough to have any kind of survival, and he doesn't survive, and he's destroyed by it. The protagonist, unnamed protagonist, he only survives by running away. He does not properly encounter it. He sees it, but it's at a distance. He sees it just as horrific, and he sees it literally as a monster rather than it's not in him. It's not part of him. Yeah. So there's lots to be said about that. But I think I probably touched on it enough. And if you're interested in these things, you need to go somewhere else to find more about them. But it represents a failure of the individuation process in Jungian terms, anyway. So let's talk about some of the cultural context. We've had the symbolism and what was happening. Of course, we had Friedrich Nietzsche, in the middle of the 19th century, but echoing from that, the death of God. So what it appeared was happening was the old Christian certainties of Europe that provided structure for the European mind had collapsed under the growth of science and rationality. And everything is seen as a balance from one thing to the other, so the rational to the symbolic, to the rational to the symbolic. We swing like a pendulum between them both, and both are necessary. Both are necessary. If we give away our rationalism and our, the Enlightenment values, we've made such progress with them. But if we surrender them all to what Freud talked about, the black mud of the occult, of these monstrous things, then we are consumed by them and destroyed. But of course, on the other hand, if we abandon this symbolic order, we are left with T.S. Eliot's wasteland, and the wasteland of the Fisher King in the Arthurian stories. If we go too much towards rationality, our spiritual origin, we dry up and we are lifeless and bored, and we have ennui and we've got nothing to live for, and we fall prey to depression and suicidality ultimately, because what is the point of the world? So we have to inhabit this dynamism between the two of them. Anyway, and this was at the end of the Victorian period, 1890s. Rationalism was in full sway. Christianity had crumbled under its assault. It might be coming back actually, but people were looking for another source of spiritual nourishment, and I think this is what it was. All this Jungian stuff, I make no quibble about it, that Jungian psychology is more akin to a religion than, say, B.F. Skinner's behavioralism and things like that, or cognitive psychology. They're not. They're sciences. But Jungian psychology is an encounter with the divine, really. It's a kind of religion. It's a cult, if you like. I don't know if it's a cult technically, because I was listening to something on the radio today, and they were talking about a definition of a cult is something that doesn't let you leave. Whereas, you can, and you can, if you want to believe in it, you can. If you don't want to, you walk away. So it's not technically a cult. I'm signed up to it, so there we are. But under my own terms, I don't belong to any organisation or anything. I go and see a Jungian analyst, obviously, but there we are. And also we would say something about, we talked about rationality, the other kind of great crisis of Victorian thought was the rise of the new woman. So these men who dominated for so long were seeing the new woman. They were terrified of the new woman. She was she was getting jobs, she was becoming teachers, she was going to university. They've ultimately allowed her to do degrees, and look where that led to: women doctors, women managers. I'm obviously not being serious about that being a bad thing. It's a good thing. I'm a child of my times. And so that was a big problem, and I suppose that's got an echo in here, that this once confident man is brought low. But ultimately, I think, in my terms, the story is a symbolic story of an encounter with the unconscious, whereby this everyday man is possessed and captured by the unconscious and does not survive. His very life depends on him looking after this chimera monster, this feathered cheetah thing, and the other guy, the protagonist, runs away. So neither of them win. Yeah? And it's a salutary tale. You've got to be strong before you can look at these things. And there we are. I love all this symbolic stuff. Not massively scary. not ghostly, supernatural, yeah. And of course, the key thing is the reincarnation, isn't it? But I mean, I think that's a surface thing. I don't think that's really what it's about. I think it's about the transformation of the anima into this chimeric monster, which is all-consuming. That's what I really think the story's about. But you could argue it's about reincarnation, but I don't know where that leads you. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Bye.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?